You're listening to the Forum Podcast, a production of Calvin Theological Seminary. For nearly 150 years, Calvin Seminary has been a thought leader in Reformed faith and scholarship. We invite you to join us and our guests as we wrestle with the questions of mercy, justice, faith, and formation. We do not have all the answers, but we believe how we pursue them matters. This is the Forum Podcast.
This is a previously unreleased episode from our content archives. While some events or references may be dated, we believe the content is just as relevant today as it was when we recorded it, and we think you'll agree. Justo Gonzalez is one of the world's leading theologians and prominent voices in calling the global church to recognize the presence and perspectives of Latino and Latina Christians. We hosted Justo and his wife, Katherine, who's also a distinguished scholar, for a conversation with Mariano Avila, Professor Emeritus of New Testament at Calvin Seminary and the retired director of our certificate in Latino Ministry. Before the discussion between Mariano and Justo, Mariano joins Calvin Seminary's Chief Operating Officer, Margaret Mwenda, for a brief introduction of Justo Gonzalez.
So, for the benefit of those who aren't familiar with Justo Gonzalez and his work, tell us about the influence he's had in the Spanish-speaking church.
Well, as you said, he is a world-leading theologian, a prominent voice in the global church. He's well-known worldwide. Justo has been a pioneer in many ways, giving voice and providing a space in the academic world to Spanish-speaking peoples. And just to give a quick example, he wrote the first history of Christianity that for the first time took seriously what happened in Latin America and the Caribbean. Before that, you read any of the standard books, La Tourette, or other books that we studied at seminaries, and the pages for Latin America were a few. So you really couldn't know it. It was like we were invisible. We never happened, or just almost like a footnote. And he wrote the first history of Christianity that took seriously, and of course that meant a lot of research, what happened in Latin America and the Caribbean, how Christianity came there, both Catholic and Protestant. And so that's a major thing for the Latin American world. He has written over 100 scholarly publications, many of them translated into major languages. Mostly, of course, in the historical theology, but also he has written beyond his field of specialty a good number of biblical commentaries, books on worship, on theology, on practical theology, and all of them, something that is surprising, are well respected by scholars in their own fields. So when he writes as a biblical scholar, people praise him for his good things that he writes. So it's an amazing man. A few years ago, ATS honored him as a key person that has contributed in significant and decisive ways to change the world of theological education. As you said, calling to the attention of the academic world and institutions for the presence and contributions also of Latinas.
Well, thank you, Mariano, for giving us a glimpse of the impact of Justo's work within the Latina Christian context. As we listened to the recording of your conversation with him, what struck you about the interview, or what would you invite us to listen for?
I would encourage you to listen with attention to what he has to say about the role of Latina communities in the United States and the challenge they represent for theological institutions like Calvin and others, but also for churches and communities in general. Justo is a visionary prophet in many ways, and it will do good to us to listen to him carefully.
Well, thank you for that, Mariano. And now, here's Luis Lugo, former professor of political science at Calvin College and former director of the Pew Research Center's Forum on Religion and Public Life, interviewing Mariano Avila and Justo Gonzalez.
So Justo, when you started your theological studies in Cuba in the mid-50s, at the Seminario Evangélico de Teología in Matanzas, and then when you came to Yale for your graduate studies in the late 50s, what was your experience as a Hispanic theological student at that time?
Well, my experience originally was that Protestantism in Cuba was something that had been brought from the U.S., and when we studied theology, we were studying things that were happening mostly in the U.S. and in Europe. 90% of the books in our library were in English, and most of the others were translated from English or from German or something into Spanish. So it seemed normal. Even though now when I look back at it, I can see the anomaly of it. At that point, Protestantism all over Latin America was very small, and the Latino community in the U.S. was very small. I remember after I finished, when I finally came to teach at Emory, that I had to look in the phone book to find a couple of other Gonzalez's or people who spoke Spanish. Now there are almost as many Gonzalez's as there are Smiths in the same phone book. But let me go back to your question. I had no sense that theology and theological studies would look different depending on your social and cultural setting that you were looking at things from. That developed as I began seeing that some things didn't make sense. I think one of the first things that I noted was just as I was finishing in seminary and coming over to graduate school, that I had been studying about Columbus and the conquest of America and all that ever since I was in third grade. When I went to seminary, we started studying about Luther and the Reformation and all that. And nobody ever told me that both things were happening at the same time. It was almost like there were two different worlds, the world of Spain and the conquest and all that, and then the religious world. And the religious world was all about Europe and North America. I remember I had a professor, my first professor in church history was a tremendous person, and we had this book that was only in English. And I told the professor, this book doesn't say anything about us. Why don't you write a book on the history of the church that really is written from our perspective? And he threw his arm around me and he said, my son, that will never happen. There's not enough of us to read it.
Interesting.
Now, that was some 60 years ago. And I don't think I have to say anything about how things have changed from there. So the changes have been enormous.
So when you finished at your graduate studies at Yale, you taught for most of the decade of the 60s at the Seminario Evangélico in Puerto Rico. Any changes during the 60s yet that you could detect?
Oh, yes, for a number of reasons. I think Puerto Rico is a unique place where issues of relationship with the U.S. and so on are always either in the forefront or in the back. They're always going. And those are always issues that had to do with the way the church organized itself. All the divisions in the church had to do mostly with those issues than with anything else. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, there I began thinking, we have to begin looking at things in a different way.
You mentioned in your article that things really began to pick up steam in terms of changes in the 1970s. Say a little bit about that. What were some of the things you were noticing?
When I began teaching in the U.S., and that was in '69, I don't know that there was any other person who was tenured, Latino, Latina person in any Protestant seminary in the whole U.S. who was tenured or even in a tenure track. What began happening in the 70s, in the 60s actually, was that some began emerging slowly. In the 70s, it picked up. For a while, in the 70s and in the early 80s, I knew all of them. Now I no longer know all of them, and I have to meet somebody that I didn't even know was there. So the change has been enormous in that sense. The other thing that I immediately noticed in the 70s was that all the churches were beginning to say, we have to do something about Latinos. It came to the point that since I was one of the very few, there would be weeks when I would go at the beginning of the week to talk to a Roman Catholic assembly of bishops who were trying to do something about Latino theological education, and then in the middle of the week I go with the Methodists, and at the end of the week I go with the Pentecostal group. As a matter of fact, that was one of the reasons that led me eventually to say, I'd rather be doing this than teaching in a school where there's so many people who can do it. But things began changing at that point. At that point, it was still not a matter of theological education. It was more, how do we minister to this new population? And now, when you get to the late 70s and the early 80s, then you begin saying, now, how do we prepare leadership for this new population? And that's, I think, where we are now, and that's a story that Mariano is very much part of it, and so on.
Yeah, it was at this point, in fact, of the story, Mariano, that you come into the picture. In the early 70s, you were doing your theological studies in another neighboring country, not Cuba, but Mexico in your case, at the Seminario Teológico Juan Calvino. How are some of the changes that Justo has just described, how are they being felt in Mexico, if at all at this time? Maybe it took a little longer.
Well, I studied with missionaries of the Christian Reformed Church, and that started my connection with them. But very interesting, even being in Mexico, most of the textbooks that we studied there were translations from English, except for our book on the story of the Christian thought by Justo. But that was part of the experience, that we were studying, having our theological education, mostly as if we were in the United States with foreign textbooks, and most of them that didn't say anything about the reality that we were living in the early 70s were still years with a lot of convulsion and situations in society, and we were so isolated from that. So that was part of my experience studying there. And the only professors that could teach at our seminary were missionaries. I remember when my last year of studies, when the faculty interviewed me, the faculty were 3 persons, it was a small seminary. I said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I have a passion for teaching. I would like to be a teacher in the seminary. And they told me, no, that's not possible. You don't have the formation, the education. Here we just people like us that was very clear message.
Wow, that's amazing. Now, so all the books, in English. Fortunately, you knew some English, but some of your other students did not. Justo, you had the same experience in Cuba, where a couple of you maybe could manage English. And then what was the process through which you then conveyed it? How did you help the other students?
Well, we would get together. There were 17 or 18 of us in the class. And we get together in the evenings in this classroom, and I will open the book in English, and then 4 people will be sitting there with typewriters, and some others were making, at that time you had to use carbon paper, so they're making sacks of carbon paper, and put them together with a paper clip so they could type, and I would just read the book out loud in Spanish. And they would type it, and then they'll pass it behind to somebody behind them, and that other person would take them out and proofread them and collate them and all that, and we ended up with typewritten textbooks in Spanish.
That's remarkable. So actually, Mariano, it was during this period in the late 70s that you came to Seminario Teológico Juan Calvino del Norte, we could call it, also known as Calvin Theological Seminary here, to pursue your master in theology. Compared to your experience with Mexico, what did you then begin to notice that was different, based on some of the trends Justo has been describing? And different, I'm saying, obviously, aside from the obvious fact that you are now doing your theological studies in English rather than in el idioma preferido del Señor, God's favorite language, Spanish. So what noticeable differences did you see at that point?
Well, we were studying the traditional things that are so interesting for this seminary. Of course, it is a denominational seminary, but also an ethnic seminary in the sense that they cherish and love the Dutch tradition. So a lot of the reading was from Dutch theologians, Dutch biblical scholars. But because of the significance of liberation theology, we had a course. And at that time, the late 70s, the works of some of the main theologians were already translated into English, so students could read them. I had to read them in English to write the papers because it was easier, but there was that awareness, at least, of some of those realities and an openness to say that probably something good can come from Nazareth or the South that is of theological interest.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, that's progress. That's progress. By inches, maybe, but it's progress. So during the tail end of this period we've been discussing, again, the 80s and then into the 90s, with the support of foundations like the Lilly Endowment and the Luz Foundation and the Pew Charitable Trust, there were several national programs that were launched for Latinos and Latinas in theological education, some of which continue to this day. Justo, you were instrumental in launching those programs. Could you say a little bit about them? What were they, and how did they help cement the presence of Latinos and Latinas in theological education?
Well, the Fund for Theological Education, FTE, which had long been a program promoting new populations in theological education. It had long had a women's program, and then it had and still has a very large African American program. Began having a very small Latino program with a small grant that they got from a foundation from Tres Palacios, Texas. When that money expired, the program expired. At that point, there were conversations between the FTE and the Pew Charitable Trust about, can we do something? Well, the trust came back and said to FTE, no, you have to have a study before that, and they entrusted me to doing that study. So that's why I got so much involved in all of those things. As part of the result of that study, there was first some funding, significant funding, 1.4 million, for the FTE, for a Hispanic program, mostly doctoral program, but also a master's program, mostly a PhD program. Time came when the support of the foundation of the trust for the FTE was going to disappear. Well, let me go back. At that point, there was also another program within the FTE grant that was a Hispanic summer program. One of the things that I found as I traveled around was I would talk to pastors, and they would tell me, when I went to seminary, I had all these great questions. I went to seminary. The first year I learned that they were not the right questions. I spent the next 2 years learning the right questions. And now that I'm out for 3 years, I know that my original questions were the right questions. But there was nobody in seminary to support me in my being different. So I said, well, we cannot have a Latino seminary. So why don't we just have, for some time in the summer, what amounts to a Latino seminary that is ecumenical, it's for the whole country. It's all for Latino professors, Latino worship, and that was the Hispanic summer program. When the time came that the Pew Charitable Trust were no longer going to support the FTE, we said we have to find ways of supporting that. And so out of that eventually came a program that's the HTI, the Hispanic Theological Initiative, which is a fantastic program of networking and so on, now housed at Princeton Seminary, but ecumenical, that has produced most of the Latino and Latina theological professors who are now serving. The Hispanic Summer Program, what we did with that was create a consortium of about 40 seminaries that each contributes some money, and it's still going on. Now, at some point, we were sitting at, three of us were sitting at the offices of the Pew Charitable Trust, and we said, you have helped Latino participation in seminaries and theological education and graduate PhD theological education. But the truth is the vast majority of Latino pastors don't go to seminary. So what are we going to do to deal with that? And out of that came the Asociación para la Educación Teológica Hispana, AETH, also through an original grant from the Pew Charitable Trusts. And that still continues with different grants from different places, support from its own constituencies. That still continues. And the idea is that here is a project of theological education that is not grounded on so much on how much you know, but on how what you know is used for the service of the community and the church.
Right.
So that, for instance, where other groups require you have to have a PhD or you have to be teaching in some particular institution to be part of that, ATA said no, all you have to do is just be committed. But anyhow, those were three of the things that came out of there. And all those three are still going, and all three of those are still flourishing, and all three of those are still very much needed.
We want to talk about the present and also the future prospects. When we look at the present, one of the realities that we have to come to terms with is the rapid growth of Pentecostalism, which if you look at global Christianity more broadly, I mean, this is, without question, the most dynamic movement, in places like, Africa, Latin America, of course, Asia, and elsewhere. Mariano, in Mexico, but even here, how do you assess that relationship of the growth of Pentecostalism to how we think about ordination, and specifically seminary preparation as a prerequisite for ordination?
Mm-hmm. Well, since the early 80s, in my experience, I was pastoring, but always involved in theological education, teaching at the Presbyterian Seminary and other institutions. Very soon, from the seminary and outside of the seminary, we discovered that with the growth of the church, there were many pastors already pastoring that never had any formal theological education. And many of them were very successful, and sometimes we joke probably they are successful because they didn't go to seminary and things like that. But of course, there was also a need, and many of those pastors were always open to learn, to study, to read serious theology or Bible books. So very early in the 80s, I got involved also in the education with different programs in Latin America, bringing theological education to those who were already in ministry. So even that question of studies and ordination, in their case was, we are here, we are doing our ministry, but we would like to learn more things that will help us to do even better what we are doing. So for me, that was a very challenging experience, because even those studies, those students coming to those studies that were usually in more informal settings, had a very different mindset when they came to study. They had questions from their life ministry, so that made always very rich the experience of learning. And since those days, I started to do a lot of that kind of training for pastors. And of course, the background education of all of them when they came together was very, very diverse, from people who probably just finished elementary school to some that had university but never went to a seminary. So that was another challenge, how to teach and discuss with those kind of differences. But it was always a very good experience.
Justo, you mentioned in the article that this phenomenon of decoupling ordination from seminary education also broke, I think you used the term, the practical monopoly of the Association of Theological Schools. So how did this play out more broadly in discussions among folks who were more traditionally connected with seminary education?
As a historian, I want to go way far back. First of all, the church did quite well for 16 centuries before it had seminaries. Seminaries were an invention of the 16th century, but originally proposed by a Roman Catholic Cardinal Pole in England, and from there it was picked up first by the Catholic Church and then by the Protestants, who already had sort of theological education through the universities. But that whole idea really comes from the second half of the 16th century.
Very interesting.
Secondly, I don't think we have to insist that there's only one way of doing things. As I look back at history, there were two great figures in the 4th century. One was St. Augustine and one was Ambrose. St. Augustine didn't want to be ordained, he wasn't planning to be ordained, he was studying theology, he became a famous theologian, and at some point he's grabbed and made a pastor. Ambrose had not studied theology, they didn't know anything about theology, and somehow he too is grabbed and made a pastor, and then he has to go and find out something about theology. And both were tremendous. Both have left an indelible stamp on the church. So I think that, first of all, I don't think we ought to say this is the solution, this is the way to go. But it is true that for a number of reasons, mainline Protestantism in the U.S., and certainly Roman Catholicism, has taken for granted that first you go to seminary and then you do. What's happening now is that you have two things happening, I think, at the same time. One is you have all these Pentecostal groups that most of them don't even have seminaries. And they have all these pastors who have been working for years, and they say, we need to know a little bit more. And they're seeking theological education. And then you have also all the other more traditional churches that did not require seminary either. Many of the African American churches, many of the Baptist churches, and so on, who not require either. But many of those people now are coming back and saying, we need to learn something. So what I see happening in seminaries right now is that more and more the number of people who are going to the regular MDiv in order then to be ordained is decreasing as the number of people who are coming already ordained, already in ministry, who want to learn, and then who usually take a different master or something because some of the things in the MDiv do not apply to them, but this other program. It's very, very interesting to see that tremendous change in seminaries today.
Yeah, but you mentioned another change, actually, that I was going to bring up, because it's the other side of the ledger, as it were. One side of the ledger is the remarkable increase in Pentecostalism, but the other, reality is the sharp decline in membership in mainline Protestant churches, who were the carriers of that, theological tradition. So that too, I think you were intimating, has had a pretty significant impact in the way we think about theological education more broadly.
Well, it has an impact on the way many theological education administrators have to look at their schools now. You have a school from a mainline denomination that used to recruit every year, let's say, 50 candidates for the MDiv, who were mostly candidates to fill pulpits in that denomination. Now that denomination needs half as many graduates. The seminary still has the same buildings, the same faculty, the same, at least, endowment, whatever. But now it cannot just say, well, we're only going to have people from our denomination and have 25 instead of 50. So what's happening? You're getting these people from these other denominations coming in. And so the seminaries are now, even traditionally very denominational seminaries, are now having to become much more open in their recruitment and in their curriculum then, because obviously now their students, many of their students are no longer people who are going to follow the exact lines that the denomination sets up. So that brings tremendous changes.
Very interesting. Mariano, Justo mentioned, and in passing there, but very importantly, that what's interesting is that even though there has been a questioning of the importance of formal theological education, in fact, you have folks from religious traditions that typically have not emphasized the importance of seminary education for ordination coming forward and saying, we sense the need for more training, which is really precisely what we're experiencing here locally with the Hispanic Ministry Certificate program at Calvin Seminary. Say a little bit more about that.
Well, when we started and with Edwin Hernandez of the Voice Foundation, we met in a meeting, and he mentioned the study that has been made, and they noticed that there was a need for theological education. We started to explore with pastors, mostly Pentecostal in the city, in the area, and we were surprised to find that the large majority of them were willing to come to a program under certain requisites that they mentioned to us. They wanted courses in Spanish by Spanish-speaking people from their own cultures that could really understand the reality. And to make it short, when we, after a year of conversations and research, we invited them for a course. We were surprised to see around 50 people coming to the course. And we said, probably, they will be here just the first week, second week, just to see how things are. But we finished 12 weeks, and we had 50 people there doing homework, working, learning, with an eagerness and desires that we were really surprised.
And now you've graduated your first cohort. That program turned into a rigorous 2-year program.
Yeah.
And now you started your second cohort with how many? I understand that was even oversubscribed, that you have more interest expressed than people you could accommodate.
Yeah, well, we graduated 35 or 40 that then enrolled in the formal program last year. And we started a group of 40. We have now 34 working with the program, and started a new certificate program on family counseling that has 41 students. And I mean, the faithfulness, the commitment to their studies, and most of them, again, from Pentecostal churches, is just a constant amazement and surprise and joy for us to see all those students. So we see now at Calvin Seminary that we are close to a 25% of the student population. Before we had 1 or 2 every year that came from someplace in Latin America to our seminary. And now we have 25% of Hispanic students. And that has been a significant change.
That's remarkable. Let's turn now to the future and discuss the challenges and opportunities theological education faces going forward. Now, one of these challenges, which is really proceeding very fast, and we've touched upon it, but I'd like to go just a little bit deeper, is the increasingly post-denominational nature of American Christianity. So, Justo, just the big picture nationally on this, and then we'll go local.
Well, with very few exceptions, most seminaries that 10 years ago were 90%, 95, 98% of their own denominations, the students were their own denomination, now are usually no more than 60%. That's one factor. The other factor is that more and more students are, precisely because of that post-denominational nature of Christianity, more and more students are choosing seminaries for geographical reasons. They're older students, they're married, they have children, they have jobs that they want to keep while they study until they decide to go out or someplace else. So they choose for geographical reasons. And that means that rather than saying, where is there a seminary of my denomination, they say, now where is the closest seminary that's easiest for me to go to? So that's another change that's taking place. So I think, yes, there is that post-denominational nature is changing things drastically. Now, I think another issue, though, that we can talk more about that is, what happens to one of those seminaries that 10 years ago was 95% of my denomination, as far as student body was concerned. And I used to go out and raise money with the churches about we're training pastors for our church. And now I have to go and say, half of our students are not of our own denomination. Unless seminary fundraisers and administrators move ahead of the curve and in their own denominations begin creating a sense that the mission of the seminary goes beyond the denomination, they're going to be in a hard place 10 years from now. Because if they're going to go to the church to raise money, and the church is going to say, no, only 20% of your students belong to our denomination. Why should we contribute all this money? So I think that's another issue that goes beyond pedagogy, also goes to the administration, fundraising, and all that.
Mariano, of course, you teach at a seminary that sits squarely within a denominational tradition. How is Calvin Theological Seminary adjusting to this new post-denominational reality?
Well, for me it has been really surprising because for 12 years I attempted to do something about the large Hispanic population in our city, and I was looking for ways to attract them to the seminary and offer what we have to offer there. And for one reason or the other was not possible. One was the language, and people will say, well, let them learn English. We have all learned English. Let them learn and come to our seminary. But there are much more obstacles than that, not just the language, is the money to afford the seminary like ours, issues of ethnicity, that people will not feel comfortable in a white seminary, or even theological, of course. The name Calvin Theological Seminary for many of our students, as they have confessed, was like, ooh.
That doesn't shout Pentecostalism.
We don't want to go there. and probably even they did some kind of exorcisms and ceremonies to feel free to go to that place. So some have said that to be jokingly, but it was quite a just to think I'm going with the Reformed people. But there are all those obstacles for people to come to a seminary. So they were there, and I knew that there was a lot of people wanting to study, but there were no bridges to make that happen. And I don't mean just for the seminary. I couldn't find a way to make that happen, the educational background or all those situations. But then it happened. We opened the program, welcoming everyone that was active in ministry, mostly pastors, but also leaders that usually in the Pentecostal church, 1 year or two, they are already pastoring. So it's we have seen that happen with our own students. So when that happened was really amazing for us to see that when people came, and we invited the president, the academic dean, and the key people at the seminary after the first course to come and see what was going on, and they saw that. I was so happy to see that they said, let's do something about it. Let's make a program. So we did, and we're very happy that we have now 2 programs of similar nature going on for Hispanic students.
Well, the one thing that we know for sure is that those who are there want to be there, because it's not required for their ordination. So, right? So those who are there really want to be there and to learn from that experience. Justo, you mentioned in your article that one of the things that is keeping, the more established seminaries from making this transition and making it successfully is what you called an elitist ethos. What do you mean by elitist ethos in many traditional seminaries?
When we were first talking with the Pew Charitable Trust about all these programs, we always used to talk about a pipeline. We're going to have these pipelines. We're going to get all these people eventually go out there and get a PhD. No, I'm not convinced that's the best image. I think that rather than a pipeline, I would like to see a drip hose, one of those hoses that's full of holes, and that you put in the ground and puts water everywhere.
Interesting.
See, and the difference is that when you have a pipeline, you measure the success of the pipeline by what comes out at the end. When you have a drip hose, you measure the success of the drip hose by how it fertilizes and waters the ground through which it goes.
Interesting.
Now, it means that we academicians, by nature, try to look at the students who can really go further, and we encourage them, and our success is in the success of those students to move into further education. That's the way we're all shaped, that's the way we all think. And we do not realize that perhaps our success is in those other mediocre students who don't go any further, but who somehow are the ones who are fertilizing the ground all around them, I mean, watering the ground all around them. So I think it's a different view of how you do things. That's one element. Another element is obviously that there's some schools who are proud that they have never used the right that the Association of Theological Schools gives them to have a certain percentage of the students without a BA, because they're too good for that.
Interesting.
And that has to do with what Mariano was mentioning earlier about the difficulties in the previous training of students, because most of our people can't afford to spend 4 years in college, paying more tuition than they would ever make in money, and then go to seminary. So if we can develop systems, good system of education that are grassroots, where the costs are minimal, and where the purpose is not that everybody's going to go to seminary. The purpose is to train people to serve the community and the church. But at the same time, those programs allow for those who should and would to move into something else. That's going to make an enormous difference in theological education. Now, so far, there are only 3 Bible institutes that have been certified by ATH, but there are another dozen or 2 that are beginning to do the process. And when there can be 20 or 30 in the country, that's going to make a difference.
That's fascinating.
In the population and the seminaries.
Justo, I think one of the most interesting points you make in the article is that increasing secularization is forcing us to view theological education not as something that you do exclusively in the seminary, but as a continuum. Somewhere between, let's say, Sunday school and catechism classes and a more formal theological education, we've had the emergence of the Bible institutes, los institutos bíblicos. Mariano, let me suggest something here and tell me if I'm off base, but is it fair to characterize the Hispanic Ministry Certificate Program as the instituto model grafted onto a more traditional seminary structure at CTS? Is that an appropriate way of thinking about it? And if so, are there any tensions in that kind of graft?
I never thought about that, but in a sense, it's something of what we are doing. And very interesting, I could count at least, 30-40% of the students there that are teaching at Bible institutes in their own denomination. That's a very interesting thing. That those who are teachers in their institutes are coming here. And when they came, one of the first things that they told us, we thought we were doing some good theological education in our institutes, but we have discovered new dimensions, more serious ways of doing things, and that has enriched their own practice. Probably I will say that like a Bible institute or a Bible college, in a sense, what we are doing at the seminary, in reality, I think is probably we are trying to develop a new way of assessing theological education that is not just linked to the academic ability of the student to know that. So if we teach a course, we are not so much interested, we are in how they master the contents of the course, but we have also a very important dimension in terms of what they do in their ministry with what they are learning. Because, as we said before, the students that come here, they don't come because they want to be pastors or they are somehow forced to be there. Mm-hmm. They come because they are interested, because they notice the needs in their own ministry. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we find that as soon as they are learning those things, they immediately are putting them into practice. And that's always very exciting. I like to go and visit their churches as anonymous as I can, which is not possible, but I just get there, try to sit in the back and see what pastors doing. And I have been amazed. One pastor to give you an example, in a mostly Guatemalan church, where the two large groups of the people there speak a Mayan language. Spanish is their way, the point of contact. And their pastor never went to a school, any school, elementary school, anything. He learned to read here in Grand Rapids, Spanish. And I was surprised to see him after a class with Justo, speaking to his class about Anselm, book on why God become man. I couldn't believe it. I was sitting there, and this pastor saying, this is so important. I have teach and preach about this, but now I know I have the words to tell you, and I can tell you about this guy, Anselmo, that wrote this huge book. And I said, wow, who could say that?
Precisely, that's amazing.
And people were happy. Mm-hmm. They were learning about that, those things.
Thank you for listening to the Forum Podcast. To learn more, go to theforum.calvinseminary.edu.